So in the book, there is a particular chapter where I specifically cite a letter from a collector of Bellary who writes to his superiors, effectively capturing the curriculum which was being taught across the schools here, from Vyakarana to Mahabharata to Shastras to trigonometry to architecture. Everything was being taught, and the important part is it was being taught to all the Chaturvarnas contrary to popular opinion. From 1835 onwards is when effectively the downfall begins. You have to realize 1835 is a significant period for one important reason, that you're looking at a society that has managed to retain its educational structure, its core educational structure, after close to 700 to 800 years of repeated invasions, which is even after invasions from the 8th century onwards until 1835, for close to 1,000 years, you have retained your educational system. That speaks volumes of the strength of your society to retain its core knowledge structure. The replacement starts after 1835. And by the time we are in the 1900s, an inspector of schools from Eastern Bengal writes this in the context of comparing the Hindu society and the Muslim society of that particular period. He specifically makes the point that the Hindu society embraced English education with open arms. And the first generation was perhaps comfortable speaking in both English as well as in the mother tongue. But by the time the second generation was educated in English, it had even forgotten its ability to spell their own names in their mother tongues. Now this was in the 1900s. We are in 2022. Imagine the number of generations that have passed ever since the introduction of this particular education system, and ask yourself if the state of affairs that meet the eye are attributable to the education system directly. If the impact of the education system was felt so deeply within 2 generations, you're at least 11 generations since the introduction of the education system. I'll give you a very clear example. So if you go to the Madras High Court or the Karnataka High Court, where they have pictures and busts of, let's say, past chief justices and let's say prominent lawyers, you will see them wearing the dhoti, the black coat and the turban. Typically the dress in which we remember Sri Vishveshwaraya, right? Try and ask yourself if you can find a similar attire in any of these courts today. So 3 weeks ago in the Delhi High Court, there was a young boy who was a junior practitioner who mustered the guts to actually wear the dhoti along with the black coat, and he entered into the courtroom. I don't think even an alien would have drawn as many stairs. And had he done the same thing perhaps in United States or United Kingdom, being an Indian, there is a decent chance that they may have welcomed it and celebrated it as a sign of cultural diversity. But in the land of dhotis, he was effectively the subject of an odd kind of attention. To my mind, although the example is superficial and perhaps crude, it tells you the extent of the problem. It tells you the degree of the problem. So here's a simple question to the audience. When someone asks you to dress up to a particular place in formals, what dress do you associate with a formal attire? Pant, shirt and suit, and that's it, right? Why is there no concept of an Indian formals? That's the problem. So the idea behind the book is to try and connect the colonized state of the Bharatiya society with its constitutional journey and say, if that was the impact of the colonial education system in the early 1900s, how do you expect the constitution to connect to Bharat's roots when perhaps it is taking forward the legacy of the colonizer? I have not arrived at a conclusion, I have merely posed a question in the book. And since it happens to be a trilogy, I will hopefully have some answers by the time I complete the trilogy. So that is more or less the saransh or the gist of this trilogy, which is to try and identify the factors which led to the constitution. So typically when you talk to constitutional lawyers, the tendency is to look at the document as a legal document. It is not a legal document. It is a socio-politico-legal document. Because the constitution effectively represents the culmination of a society's journey at a given point of time. Therefore, it is heavily influenced by the history of that particular point of time. So when someone worships the constitution, or someone says this is the ultimate book that all of us must surrender to and submit to and do Sashtanga Namaskara, I end up saying, I'm sorry, it's a hardcore historical and political document. And therefore, it is always subject to the ravages of time and history. So be extremely wary of surrendering to a particular document. Respect the document simply because it happens to be a product of your journey. But always realize that the Constitution is the product of history. History is not the product of the Constitution. So whenever you look at the Constitution, your first prism or the first lens through which you look at the Constitution has to be, must be, and should be the history of that particular period first. Without that, your understanding of the Constitution is extremely truncated. How many students of law do we have here? Chartered accountants are anyway semi-students of law. How many pure students of law do we have here? Someone who's done their LLB. Okay. So whenever you talk to students of law and you ask them, how do you make sense of a particular provision of the Constitution? The immediate tendency is to go to the Constituent Assembly debates. To see, let us see what the debates say. Just as you look for parliamentary debates, if at all there is an ambiguity in a statutory provision, similarly when there is a certain interpretational problem with respect to the Constitution, you look at the Constituent Assembly debates. But the debates only tell you what was discussed. The debates don't tell you why were people thinking in a certain manner. So over the last few years, I think there has been a sudden discussion around making Sanskrit perhaps the national language of the country so that it can be spoken across the country as a replacement for perhaps Hindi or English. And this debate seems to be, it's a recurring debate constantly over every few years it comes about for one reason or the other. So there is a well-known lawyer in the Supreme Court and who is also an MP from Puri, Sri Pinaki Mishra, whose father, Lokanath Mishra, was one of the members of the Constituent Assembly. He was the first one to propose Bharat as a replacement for India when Article 1 was being drafted. When Sri Ambedkar was putting together the Constitution after he received the first draft, he did not have Bharat in mind at all. He simply called India a union of states. There was no reference to Bharat, there was no reference to Hindustan, there was no reference to Bharatvarsha, nothing. Lokanath Mishra suggests, when you are putting together the constitution for an independent republic after independence, why are we going with the name India? How is this an Indian name? How is this a Bharatiya name? So therefore an amendment is proposed, Bharat. Now how many people who are attending this particular session go by two names in public? I would like to understand if there is any individual who is present in this room who goes by two official names in public. Oh really? Okay. Is that part of the same name? No. Okay. Is it a normal thing for a person to have two names in public? Okay. Shouldn't the very same logic be extended and applied to a country as well as to why does it subscribe to two names, India and Bharat? That itself shows a multiple personality disorder. So that's the point of the book, to say that there is a consciousness problem where you seem to have two different identities. Although Article 1 says India, that is Bharat, why do you need two names which say one is the same as the other? Why can't it be one? How was the choice even made? And how many countries do we know of in the world which have two names? So clearly there is a fundamental problem, which is to say that your psychology is a divided psychology. And the divided psychology has to be traced to history, your education system, and multiple factors. So that is the essence of this entire so-called not so academic exercise. And the hope is that from Bharat to India was a painful journey. From India to Bharat will again be a painful journey, but hopefully this will be a journey for eternity, and hopefully this will be a journey for the better.